On Mother's Day, my daughter gave her mother-in-law a $20,000 ring and a luxury cruise package, and she handed me a small plastic bag that weighed less than a cup of sugar. I remember staring at it for a second longer than I should have, my fingers tightening slightly around the thin handles, as if it might somehow reveal a mistake, like maybe the real gift was still coming. Maybe this was just part of a joke I didn't understand yet. The restaurant was one of those upscale places Emily loved, all soft lighting and white tablecloths, the kind where even the water glasses looked expensive. And I had arrived 10 minutes early because that's what I've always done. Show up prepared, show up on time, show up ready to make things easier for everyone else. I had even worn the pearl necklace my late husband gave me on our 30th anniversary, thinking it felt appropriate for the occasion. Something simple but meaningful, something that reminded me of who I used to be before everything got so quiet. Emily walked in with Diane on her arm, laughing, glowing, like the entire day had been designed just for that moment. And for a brief second, I felt proud watching her, the same way I used to when she was a little girl holding my hand on her first day of school. We hugged, polite and quick, and she said, "Happy Mother's Day, Mom," in that distracted tone people use when their attention is already somewhere else, and then immediately turned to Diane, adjusting her chair, asking if she was comfortable, calling the waiter over before Diane even had to look up from the menu. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe she was just trying to impress her husband's family, that these things happen, that daughters grow up and their priorities shift. And I smiled the way I've learned to smile, soft, agreeable, easy to overlook. The meal went on with small talk and polite laughter, and I noticed how Emily leaned in closer every time Diane spoke, how she nodded a little too eagerly, how she refilled Diane's glass before it was even halfway empty. And I sat there quietly, folding my napkin on my lap, reminding myself not to read too much into it. Then the moment came when Emily reached under the table and pulled out a velvet box, placing it gently in front of Diane with both hands, like it was something sacred, and the entire table seemed to lean forward at once. "This is for you," she said, her voice warm and bright, "because you've done so much for me." And when Diane opened it, the diamond caught the light in a way that made the whole room feel still for a second, like even the air had paused to admire it. People clapped softly. Someone said it was beautiful, and Emily beamed, soaking in the approval, while I sat there with my hands folded, my smile still in place, waiting for my turn. Not because I expected something extravagant, but because I thought, at the very least, I would be remembered in a way that felt real. And then she turned to me, almost as an afterthought, and slid that small plastic bag across the table, saying, "And this is for you, Mom," like she was checking something off a list. I looked down at it, then back at her, searching her face for any sign that she had just done. But all I saw was satisfaction, like she believed she had done everything right. I opened the bag slowly, careful not to rush, because rushing would mean admitting that something inside me had already cracked. And inside was a cheap, lightweight trinket, something you might find in the clearance aisle of a dollar store, something that didn't carry weight, or thought, or memory, just plastic shaped to resemble a gesture. I held it in my hand, feeling how light it was, how insignificant. And in that moment, surrounded by soft music and polite applause, I realized that this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't forgetfulness, and it certainly wasn't innocent. I did not say anything for the rest of that lunch, not because I did not have words, but because I suddenly understood that anything I said would only make me look smaller in a room where I had already been reduced to something light enough to fit inside a plastic bag. I placed the gift carefully back on the table beside my plate, aligning it with the edge, as if it deserved the same order and respect I had always tried to bring into my home. And I nodded when someone asked if I liked it, because it was easier than explaining what it felt like to be seen so clearly and yet so poorly at the same time. The waiter came by to refill our glasses, and I thanked him with a smile that felt practiced, the kind that does not reach your eyes, but still convinces everyone around you that everything is fine. Emily continued talking about the cruise she had booked, describing the ocean views, the private balcony, the spa package, all the little details that made Diane laugh with that soft, pleased kind of laughter that comes from feeling chosen. And I sat there listening, noticing how Emily's voice softened for her, how she leaned in just a little closer, how every word carried a kind of care that I could not remember the last time she had used with me. I told myself again that maybe I was being unfair, that relationships change, that daughters build new families and shift their attention where it is needed most. But there was something in the way Emily avoided looking directly at me that made it harder to hold on to that thought. When the check arrived, Emily reached for it quickly, insisting it was her treat, and everyone praised her generosity, calling her thoughtful, calling her devoted, and I felt a strange tightening in my chest because I knew, in a quiet way that did not need proof, that this generosity had direction, that it was not meant for me. After lunch, we stepped outside into the bright afternoon light, the kind that makes everything look sharper than it really is, and Emily hugged Diane first, holding on a little longer, whispering something that made Diane smile even wider. And then she turned to me, giving me a quick embrace that felt more like a gesture than a connection. I held her for a second longer than she expected, not to make her uncomfortable, but because I was trying to remember what it felt like when she used to hold on to me the same way, when she was small, when I was the center of her world, instead of an obligation she managed politely. On the drive home, the plastic gift sat on the passenger seat beside me, sliding slightly with each turn, light enough to move with every small shift in the road, and I kept glancing at it at stoplights, not because I wanted to, but because it felt like it was saying something I had not fully allowed myself to hear yet. When I got back to my house, the quiet met me at the door the same way it always had since my husband passed, steady and familiar, and I set my keys down in the same bowl by the entryway, following the same routine that had once felt comforting, but now only reminded me of how much space there was around me. I carried the bag into the kitchen and placed it on the counter, then stood there for a moment, looking at it without touching it, as if distance might soften what it represented. The refrigerator hummed softly in the background, and the clock on the wall ticked in slow, even seconds, and I realized that this was the first Mother's Day in my life where I did not feel like a mother at all, just someone who used to be one. I thought about the years I had spent raising Emily, the nights I stayed awake when she was sick, the birthday cakes I baked from scratch, the school projects I helped her finish at the last minute, the college tuition I worked extra hours to help cover, all the small, quiet investments that never came with applause, never came with recognition, but it always felt worthwhile because they were for her. And now, standing alone in my kitchen with that weightless gift sitting in front of me, I felt something shift inside me, not breaking, not even cracking, but settling into place in a way that was colder and clearer than anything I had allowed myself to feel before. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because something in my mind refused to stay quiet, like a thought that had been waiting patiently for years and had finally decided it was time to be heard. The sunlight came through the kitchen window in thin, pale lines, landing across the counter where the plastic gift still sat exactly where I had left it, untouched, unchanged, as if it belonged there more than I did. I made myself a cup of coffee the same way I always had, 2 scoops of grounds, a splash of milk, no sugar, and I stood by the sink holding the mug in both hands, letting the warmth settle into my palms while I looked out at the empty backyard. It used to be different back there, filled with laughter, with birthday parties and small plastic chairs, and a swing set that my husband had assembled himself one summer afternoon, sweating through his shirt but smiling the entire time because Emily could not stop clapping her hands in excitement. I could almost hear her voice if I let myself think about it long enough, high and bright and full of trust, calling out for me like I was the answer to every question she had. I took a slow sip of coffee and set the mug down, turning back to the counter where the bag waited. And this time, I reached for it. Not carefully, not gently, just enough to feel the texture of it in my hand. It was cheap, thin, the kind of plastic that crinkles too loudly in a quiet room. And I pulled the item out again, turning it over in my fingers as if there might be something I had missed the first time. There was no engraving, no note, no sign that it had been chosen with any thought beyond obligation. And for the first time, I allowed myself to ask a question I had avoided for longer than I realized. When did this start? Not yesterday, not at that table, not even this year, but somewhere earlier, somewhere quieter, in moments I had dismissed because it felt easier to believe in misunderstandings than in patterns. I walked into the living room and sat down slowly, the couch dipping slightly under my weight, and I looked around at the framed photos lining the shelves, each one capturing a version of us that felt further away than the last. There was Emily at 10, holding a science fair ribbon, her smile wide and proud, her arm wrapped tightly around my waist like she never wanted to let go. There was her graduation day, her cap slightly crooked, tears in her eyes as she hugged me and said she could not have done it without me. And then there were the more recent photos, the ones where I stood just a little further to the side, where her attention was angled toward someone else, where Diane had gradually moved closer to the center of every frame, without me noticing when it happened. I leaned forward and placed the plastic item on the coffee table, right in the middle, and I stared at it the same way I used to study bills when I was trying to figure out how to make everything stretch just a little further. It was not about the money, I told myself, not about the difference between something that cost $5 and something that cost $20,000, because I had never measured love that way, not when I was raising her, not when I was working overtime to make sure she had what she needed, not when I went without so she would not have to. But this was not about money. It was about intention, about where value was placed, about who was seen and who was simply expected to remain in the background without asking questions. And the more I sat there, the more the silence in the room felt less like loneliness and more like clarity, like something had finally settled into place that I could not ignore anymore. And for the first time, I did not rush to defend her in my own thoughts. I did not search for excuses or soften the edges of what I was beginning to understand, because deep down, I already knew that this had not been a single moment. It had been a series of choices, repeated quietly over time, until they became impossible to pretend not to see. I did not move from that couch for a long time, not because I was tired, but because every time I tried to stand, another memory surfaced, quiet and ordinary at first, but sharper now that I was finally looking at it without softening the edges. It was strange how the mind works, how it stores things away neatly until one moment forces everything back into the light, and suddenly what once felt harmless begins to look intentional. I thought about last Christmas, how Emily had called me 2 days before and said they were keeping things small that year, just immediate family, her voice careful, almost rehearsed. And I had told her I understood. Of course I did. I always did. And I spent that evening alone with a plate of reheated leftovers, watching old movies I had seen too many times. Later, I saw the photos online, a long table filled with people, laughter frozen in bright images, Diane sitting right at the center, Emily leaning close to her again, smiling that same wide smile I had seen at the restaurant. I remember telling myself there must have been a reason, that plans change, that maybe it was not meant to hurt me, and I let it go the same way I had let so many other things go. Then there was the time Emily told me the kids were too busy for a weekend visit, that schedules were tight, that it would be better to wait. And I believed her. I always believed her. Until I saw a picture days later of them all at Diane's house, baking cookies, the caption filled with words about family traditions and togetherness. Even then, I told myself not to read into it, not to make it bigger than it was, because I had never wanted to be the kind of mother who demanded attention or made her children feel guilty. But sitting there now, with that small plastic object still in front of me, those moments lined up differently, not as isolated incidents, but as pieces of something consistent, something that had been building quietly over time while I chose not to see it. I stood up finally and walked to the hallway, where I kept a small drawer filled with old cards and letters, things I had saved over the years without really thinking about why. And I pulled it open, flipping through birthdays, holidays, handwritten notes from a younger version of Emily, whose words felt warmer, more present, more connected to me in a way that felt almost unfamiliar now. There was a card she gave me when she was 12, the handwriting uneven but careful, telling me I was her best friend, that she hoped she would grow up to be just like me. And I held that card for a moment longer than the others, tracing the ink with my finger, as if it might lead me back to a time when things made more sense. I set it aside and closed the drawer slowly, the sound of it sliding shut echoing softly in the quiet house. And I realized that what hurt the most was not the difference in gifts, not the numbers or the appearances, but the shift in how I existed in her life, from someone essential to someone optional, someone who could be acknowledged with something light, something easy, something that required no real thought. I walked back into the living room and looked once more at the object on the table, and for the first time, I did not feel confused or even particularly hurt in the way I had the day before. Instead, I felt something steadier, something clearer, like the moment after a long storm, when everything is still, and you can finally see what has changed. And as I stood there, I understood that this was not about trying to fix what had already been decided without me, and it was not about asking questions that I already knew the answers to. Because some answers reveal themselves not through words, but through patterns that repeat until they can no longer be ignored. And I had reached the point where ignoring them was no longer something I was willing to do. I did not call Emily that day, and I did not send a message, even though my phone sat on the kitchen counter within reach, silent and still, as if waiting for me to make the first move, like I always had. Instead, I went about my day the way I used to, when life felt predictable, folding laundry, wiping down counters, watering the small plants by the window. But everything felt slightly different, not heavier, not even sadder, just clearer, like I was finally seeing the space around me without trying to fill it with explanations that did not belong there. Around noon, my phone buzzed, and for a brief second, I thought it might be her. Maybe a follow-up, maybe a message that would soften what had already been done. But when I looked at the screen, it was my neighbor, Carol, asking if I wanted to join her for a late lunch later that week. I stared at the message for a moment longer than necessary, then typed back a simple yes, because for the first time in a long while, I realized I did not need to keep my schedule open for someone who only filled it when it was convenient. I set the phone down again and returned to the living room, where the object still sat in the center of the table, and I picked it up once more, turning it over slowly, not searching for meaning this time, but acknowledging it for what it was. It was not just a cheap item, it was a decision, one that had been made without hesitation, without consideration, and that understanding settled quietly inside me in a way that felt steady rather than overwhelming. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside and walked to the mailbox, the air warm and still, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass from somewhere down the street. And I realized how long it had been since I had taken a walk without feeling like I was waiting for something. A call, a visit, a moment that might remind me that I still held a place in someone's life. Inside the mailbox was a small stack of envelopes, bills mostly, routine things that once would have felt like burdens but now seemed simple and manageable. And as I flipped through them, one envelope caught my attention, thicker than the others, addressed in handwriting I recognized but had not seen in years. I carried it back inside and set it on the table, opening it carefully. And inside was a card from an old friend I had not spoken to in a long time, someone who had moved away after her husband passed, someone who used to sit with me on this very couch and talk for hours about nothing and everything at once. The message was simple, just a few lines wishing me well and saying she had been thinking about me, but it was written in a way that felt present, intentional, like each word had been chosen with care. And I sat there holding that card, feeling the difference between something given out of habit and something given out of genuine thought. I placed the card beside the plastic item on the table, looking at them both for a moment, and the contrast was so clear it almost felt quiet, like it did not need explanation. One was light, forgettable, something that could be picked up and set down without leaving a trace, and the other carried weight, not in ounces or dollars, but in intention, in the simple act of someone taking the time to think of me without being asked. I leaned back slowly and let out a breath I had not realized I was holding, and for the first time since that lunch, I did not feel the need to question what had happened or why it had happened, because the answer was already there, sitting in front of me, not in the object itself, but in everything it represented. And in that quiet understanding, something inside me began to shift. Not in a dramatic way, not with anger or confrontation, but with a calm, deliberate awareness that the way I had been treated was not something I had to continue accepting without change. The following day, I drove across town to meet Carol for lunch, and it felt unfamiliar at first. Not the drive itself, but the reason behind it. Because for so long, my days had revolved around waiting rather than choosing, around adjusting myself to fit into someone else's schedule instead of creating one of my own. The restaurant she picked was small and quiet, nothing like the polished place from the day before, just a simple corner cafe with sunlight pouring through wide windows and the soft clatter of dishes in the background. And when I walked in, Carol was already there, waving at me with a smile that reached her eyes, in a way I had not realized I had been missing. She stood up and hugged me, not quickly, not out of obligation, but with a kind of warmth that felt steady and unforced. And for a moment I noticed how natural it felt, how uncomplicated. We sat down and ordered, and she asked me how I had been, not as a formality, but in a way that left space for a real answer, and I found myself pausing, not because I did not know what to say, but because I was not used to being asked in a way that truly invited honesty. I told her I had been fine, which was what I had always said, but something in my voice must have shifted slightly, because she tilted her head just a little and said, "You do not sound fine," in a tone that was gentle, not intrusive, just observant. I looked down at my hands for a moment, noticing the small lines in my skin, the way time had settled into them, and I realized that for once, I did not feel the need to protect someone else from the truth of how I felt. So I told her about the lunch, about the gifts, about the small plastic bag that had felt lighter than it should have, and I kept my voice even, not dramatic, not emotional, just steady, the way I had learned to tell things that mattered without making them louder than they needed to be. Carol listened without interrupting, her expression calm but attentive, and when I finished, she did not rush to offer explanations or excuses the way I had always done for Emily. Instead, she simply said, "That was not an accident," and the words landed in a way that felt both obvious and strangely relieving because they confirmed what I had already begun to understand on my own. We talked for a while longer, about small things, about her move, about the neighborhood, about how life changes in ways you do not always notice until one moment makes everything clear. And I found myself relaxing into the conversation, not because the situation had improved, but because I was no longer carrying it alone in my own thoughts. When the check came, we split it without discussion, each reaching for our wallets at the same time. And there was something simple and balanced about that moment that stayed with me as I drove home later, something that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with mutual regard. Back at the house, I walked in and placed my keys in the bowl again, the same familiar motion, but this time it did not feel like I was returning to emptiness. It felt like I was stepping into a space that belonged to me in a way I had not fully claimed before. The card from my friend was still on the table, and beside it, the plastic item remained where I had left it, unchanged, and I looked at them both for a moment before picking up the card again, reading the lines slowly, letting the intention behind them settle in. Then I set it down and picked up the other item, not with hesitation this time, but with clarity, and I carried it to the kitchen, placing it inside a drawer, without ceremony, without anger, just a quiet decision that it did not deserve to sit at the center of my space any longer. As I closed the drawer, I realized that something had shifted in a way that felt permanent, not loud or visible, but steady, like a line that had been drawn without needing to be announced. And for the first time, I was not thinking about what I might say to Emily or how I might explain anything to her, because I was beginning to understand that some realizations are not meant to be explained. They are meant to be acted on, quietly, deliberately, and without asking for permission. A few days passed without a word from Emily, and I noticed it in the same quiet way I noticed everything else now, without rushing to fill the silence with assumptions or excuses. In the past, I would have reached out by then, sent a message asking how she was, offered to help with something, created a reason to stay connected even if the connection had already begun to thin. But this time, I let the space remain exactly as it was, untouched. On the fourth day, my phone rang in the late afternoon while I was folding laundry, and when I saw her name on the screen, I did not feel the usual mix of relief and urgency, just a calm awareness that she had finally decided to call. I answered after the second ring, my voice steady as I said hello, and there was a brief pause on the other end, the kind that happens when someone expects a different tone than the one they received. She asked how I was, casual, almost distracted, and I told her I was doing well, which was true in a way she would not have understood before. She moved quickly into talking about her week, about errands and plans, and something Diane had said that made her laugh, and I listened without interrupting, noticing how naturally Diane's name came up, how easily it fit into her stories. After a moment, she mentioned the lunch, asking if I had liked everything, and I could hear something underneath the question, not quite concern, more like a routine check to confirm that everything had gone according to her expectations. I said it was a nice meal, and there was another small pause, as if she was waiting for something more, something emotional, something that would allow her to respond in a way she had prepared for, but I did not offer it. Instead, I asked her how the kids were doing, and she answered quickly, moving the conversation along, filling the space with details that felt surface level, efficient, controlled. At one point, she said, "I hope you did not mind the gift. I just thought you would appreciate something simple." And her tone was light, almost dismissive, as if she had already decided how I should feel about it. I held the phone a little tighter, not out of anger, but because I was listening more carefully now, and I realized that this was the first time she had acknowledged it at all. I could have responded in a dozen different ways. I could have explained, questioned, even laughed it off the way I had done so many times before. But instead, I simply said, "I understand," and let the words settle between us without adding anything else. There was a shift on the line then, subtle but noticeable, like she was trying to recalibrate the conversation, unsure of where to place me now that I was not reacting in the way she expected. She changed the subject again, talking about an upcoming trip, mentioning how excited Diane was, and I listened, not with the quiet hope of being included, but with a clear understanding of where I stood in that story. When the call ended, it did not linger the way it used to. It did not leave behind that hollow feeling of wanting more, because I was no longer measuring it against something it was never going to be. I set the phone down and finished folding the laundry, placing each item neatly in its place, and as I moved through the simple routine, I realized that nothing she had said had surprised me. Not her tone, not her explanation, not even the way she had framed the situation as something small and reasonable. What had changed was not her behavior, but my willingness to see it clearly, without trying to reshape it into something more comforting. Later that evening, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the light fade slowly from the sky, and I thought about the conversation. Not replaying it, not analyzing it, just acknowledging it for what it was. There had been no apology, no recognition, no attempt to understand, and for the first time, I did not feel the need to wait for those things to come. Instead, I felt a quiet certainty settle in, something firm and grounded, like I had finally stepped out of a pattern I had been repeating for years without realizing it. And as the room grew darker and the day came to a close, I understood that this was no longer about what she might do differently. It was about what I would choose to do next. The next morning, I woke up with a kind of quiet clarity that felt unfamiliar but steady, like something inside me had finally settled after years of shifting without direction. I did not reach for my phone right away the way I used to, checking for messages, waiting for something that would remind me I still had a place in someone else's day. Instead, I sat at the edge of my bed for a moment, letting the silence exist without trying to fill it, and I realized that it no longer felt empty. It felt honest.
I got dressed slowly, choosing a simple outfit, and made my way to the kitchen, where the light came in soft and even, the same as every morning, but this time I noticed it differently, like I was actually present in my own space, instead of passing through it on my way to someone else's expectations. I made breakfast for myself, something I had not done with intention in a long time, just toast and eggs, nothing special, but I sat down at the table and ate without distraction, without rushing, without thinking about who else might need me. Afterward, I walked into the living room and looked around, really looked, at the furniture, the photographs, the small details that had always been there, but had somehow faded into the background of my own life. I saw where I had held on too tightly, where I had kept things in place out of habit rather than meaning, and I began to move slowly through the room, adjusting, clearing, not in a dramatic way, but with quiet purpose. I removed a few photographs where I stood at the edge, where my presence felt like an afterthought, and placed them gently into a drawer. Not out of anger, but out of recognition that I no longer needed to see myself that way every day. I kept the ones that felt real, the ones where connection was clear, where I could remember what it felt like to belong without question.
Later that afternoon, I drove to the bank, something I had been meaning to do for a while but had always postponed. And as I sat across from the advisor, I spoke calmly about my accounts, my plans, the things I wanted to organize moving forward. There was no urgency in my voice, no frustration, just a clear intention to take ownership of things I had once assumed would naturally fall into place within my family. The advisor listened, nodding, asking a few questions, and I answered that without hesitation, because for the first time, I was not thinking about what anyone else might expect from me. I was thinking about what made sense for me. When I left the bank, the air outside felt lighter, not because anything around me had changed, but because something inside me had shifted into alignment with a truth I had avoided for too long. That evening, I returned home and made a cup of tea, sitting by the window again as the light softened into dusk, and I thought about Emily, not with the sharpness of hurt or the weight of disappointment, but with a calm understanding of who she had chosen to be and where she had chosen to place her attention. I did not feel the need to call her, to explain anything, or to wait for her to understand something she had already shown me she was not interested in seeing. Instead, I let the day settle around me, steady and quiet, and I realized that this was not the beginning of something ending. It was the beginning of something shifting into place, something that no longer depended on being chosen by someone else in order to feel complete. 2 weeks later, Emily called again, this time asking if I would be available to come by her house the following Sunday, saying the kids missed me and that it had been too long since we all sat down together. And I listened carefully to the way she framed it, not as an invitation filled with warmth, but as something that sounded convenient, something that fit neatly into her schedule. I told her I would think about it, and there was a pause on the line, longer this time, as if she was not used to hearing anything other than an immediate yes. And she said, "Well, let me know soon, because Diane might also come over." And the way she said it was casual, but it carried a familiar weight, the same quiet comparison that had been present all along. I thanked her for letting me know and ended the call shortly after, not abruptly, just without extending it the way I used to. And I sat there for a moment with the phone in my hand, noticing how different it felt to not rearrange my time around a request that did not truly consider me. That Sunday morning, I woke up early, made my coffee, and sat by the window as I had done in the days before, watching the neighborhood come to life slowly, people walking their dogs, cars pulling out of driveways, small routines unfolding in quiet, predictable ways. I thought about the invitation, about the years I had spent showing up, bringing dishes, offering help, adjusting myself to fit into spaces where I was gradually being moved further to the side. And I realized that I no longer felt the same pull to go, simply because I had always gone. Instead, I got dressed and drove in the opposite direction,
heading toward the small park by the lake where I used to take Emily when she was young, where she would run ahead of me on the path, turning back every few steps to make sure I was still there. I parked the car and stepped out into the fresh air, the breeze light against my face, and I walked slowly along the path, taking in the sound of water, the distant laughter of children, the steady rhythm of my own steps. I found a bench near the edge of the lake and sat down, letting the quiet settle around me, not as something empty, but as something full, something that belonged entirely to me without needing to be shared or approved. My phone buzzed once in my bag, and I knew without looking that it was Emily, likely checking if I was on my way. And for the first time, I did not feel any urgency to respond immediately. I let it sit there, just as I had let so many things sit before. But this time it was different, because I was choosing the silence rather than waiting inside it. I stayed at the park for a while longer, watching the light move across the water, thinking not about what had happened, but about what I wanted the days ahead to look like. And when I finally stood up to leave, I felt steady in a way that did not require confirmation from anyone else. When I got back home, I checked my phone and saw a short message from Emily asking if everything was okay, and I replied simply, "I am spending the day for myself. Nothing more, nothing less." And I placed the phone down without waiting for a response. I walked into the kitchen, made another cup of tea, and stood there for a moment, looking out at the quiet space that had once felt too large and now felt just right.
And as I stood there, I realized that nothing dramatic had happened. No confrontation, no raised voices, no need to prove anything. Just a series of small, deliberate choices that had slowly shifted the way I moved through my own life. And in that quiet shift, I found something I had not realized I had lost, a sense of self that did not depend on being chosen, acknowledged, or remembered by anyone else, but existed fully on its own, steady and complete.